This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we apply our patent-pending Stanley rubric to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Harrison Ford, Kate Capshaw, and Jonathan Ke Quan. I hope I got that right. However, quickly before we get to the show, next week we are finishing the original Indiana Jones trilogy with The Last Crusade, starring Harrison Ford, Sean Connery, Julian Glover, and Denholm Elliott. You won't want to miss that one, so please watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. Also, you can still sign up for our weekly newsletter either by the website in the show notes. You can subscribe at the bottom of every page, or you can also email us at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Additionally, did you know that our website has the full notes for every episode of the show, as well as the master list of movies we've graded so far? There are links in the episode descriptions of every episode to direct you right there, so check them out. And, as always, please like, follow, rate, and review the show on whichever podcast platform you use. With that, Dad, this is the second movie in the original Indiana Jones trilogy, and you were in high school, college about this time? What do you remember about this franchise?
College. It was 1984. So, well, first of all, I know that there was a trilogy of films, although there actually is 4 of them. So it's not really a trilogy.
That's why I said original trilogy.
Ah,
There's a big gap between 1989 and 2007.
yeah. Well, when I was in college at the time, so this came out the summer between my sophomore and junior year of college. I went to the theater, saw it. I remember going, and quite frankly, I'll admit I don't think I've seen the film since it was released and I saw it at the theaters.
Yeah, I couldn't put a thumb on where I might have seen this before, or I guess not before, but for the first time. So it's just something that I have remembered watching. I would say that out of the 4 Indiana Jones movies, most people will put Raiders 1, probably Last Crusade 2, Temple of Doom, kind of there's a gap between that and the other two as number 3, and then there's a large gap where people won't even recognize Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, including myself, as part of the Indiana Jones lore. I think we might be forced to with this new movie that's supposedly coming out that I think they're still filming because Harrison Ford got hurt again on the set. But that's what happens when you have a 70-year-old man doing action stunts.
Well, I have the working title for Indiana Jones 6. Indiana Jones and the Search for the Aluminum Walker.
Why couldn't you have just done the remote? Regardless of any of that, this is clearly a defining character of cinema. It was voted, I think we said in the last episode, as AFI's number 2 hero of all time. So what is it that makes Indiana Jones such an endearing character? Is it simply Harrison Ford's charisma, or is there something else?
Well, Harrison Ford is Indiana Jones, and Indiana Jones is Harrison Ford. Harrison Ford has it's that wry little smile that he has sometimes when he's up to no good, a little bit of mischief. That's Indiana Jones. That's the whole character of Indiana Jones. It's a cross between him being a funny character and a badass. And that's what makes him so appealing, is because he's not always a badass and he's not always comical. He is a blend of the two, and it is able to draw out the intensity and the drama, the suspense, and then break it up with a little bit of comedy, and then go back into it and be suspenseful again, and then a little bit of comedy. And it That's what makes it so enjoyable.
So, in thinking about this again this week, and I know we kind of related the formula for the original Raiders was more based on the serials that you'd have these basically 10-minute clips, but they were all strung together to make a 2-hour movie instead of just these small bite sized episodes. And so they reused that format pretty much for every film since. However, this reminds me a lot of something similar to like Buster Keaton in The General, that he's kind of chasing after stuff, and there's very small pieces of this movie that you could break apart and make into individual episodes by themselves. But this is also something that he's kind of almost superhero like in that he just gets incredibly lucky on most occasions.
It's kind of almost the equivalent of James Bond, which is, until Daniel Craig, which is James Bond could have a fist fight and be beaten up and beat somebody else up, and then kind of fluff his jacket and he's ready to go. There's not a mark on him. There's no way half of what Harrison Ford or what Indiana Jones goes through in these films could really happen without him having some need for some significant medical treatment.
Well, I mean, just remembering the truck scene or the truck chase from the first one, he gets shot in the arm, and then the guy's like repeatedly punching him in the arm where he got shot. I mean, that
Yes.
alone, you would think that there's a significant level of trauma that he would almost pass out from.
Yeah, I know.
It is almost fantastical in the way that these stories are constructed, and yet you're gripped and still kind of on the edge of your seat no matter how many times you've seen them.
Well, and that's the beauty of it, which is it is fantastical. I mean, this is movies. And you realize it's movies. So you kind of give it an excuse. It's not completely believable.
So let's get to some context for the movie. Do you have your plot summary ready?
I do. In 1935, Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford, survives a crooked deal gone sideways with crime boss Lao Che in Shanghai with fellow travelers Short Round, Jonathan Ke Quan, and nightclub singer Willie Scott, Kate Capshaw, arriving in the village of Mayapore in northern India. Unfortunately, the village appears to have been struck by plague due to the loss of their sacred stone shivalinga, stolen from their shrine. The villagers plead for aid in retrieving the stone along with their missing children from the evil forces of the nearby Pankot Palace, where a new Maharaja has been seated. Indiana's questions about the mysterious Thugee cult are real, and he, Willie, and Short Round race to survive the Temple of Doom.
Thank you. Cast for this movie: Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, Kate Capshaw as Willie Scott, Amrish Puri as Mola Ram, Roshan Seth as Chatter Lal, Philip Stone as Captain Philip Lumbert, Jonathan Ke Quan as Short Round, Raj Singh, dubbed by Katie Lee, portrays Zalim Singh, the Maharaja. Roy Chow plays Lao Che. Recognition for this movie: it was nominated for Best Original Score and won Best Visual Effects at the 1985 Academy Awards. In response to some of the more violent sequences in the film, and with similar complaints about Gremlins, Spielberg suggested that the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, alter its rating systems by introducing an intermediary between the PG and R ratings. The MPAA concurred, and a new PG-13 rating was introduced 2 months after the film's release. Temple of Doom was released on May 23, 1984 in America, accumulating a record-breaking 45.7 million in its first week. The film went on to gross 333.1 million worldwide, with 180 million in North America and 153.1 million in other markets. The film had the highest opening weekend of 1984 and was that year's highest grossing film, but only third in North America behind Beverly Hills Cop and Ghostbusters. It was also the 10th highest grossing film of all time during its release. Did you know? The three main characters are named after dogs. Short Round was named after screenwriter Willard Huck's dog, which was named after the orphan in the steel helmet from 1951. Willie was named after Steven Spielberg's dog, and Indiana was named after George Lucas's dog. Did you know? Kate Capshaw had to be taught how to scream for this movie, and she screams a grand total of 71 times throughout the film. Did you know? Kate Capshaw was very critical of her own character, saying that Willie was not, quote, much more than a dumb screaming blonde, end quote. Did you know? Dr. Nanayakara, cast as the Indian village shaman, did not speak a word of English. He delivered his lines phonetically by mimicking Steven Spielberg, who was prompting him off camera. The pauses in his dialogue were therefore not for dramatic effect, but rather waiting for his next line. Did you know? For the bug chamber sequence, Kate Capshaw was really covered with over 2,000 insects. She took sedatives prior to the scene to get over her initial fear and claimed they definitely worked. Did you know? Amrish Puri shaved his head for the role of Mola Ram. This created such an impression that he kept this look and became one of India's most popular film villains. Did you know? The nightclub in the opening scene is called Club Obi-Wan, an obvious homage to the Star Wars character. Did you know? The sounds of the mine car running along the tracks during the chase scene were recorded on the roller coasters at Disneyland, with the music and sound effects turned off. Did you know? The python that Willie Scott mistakes for an elephant's trunk was brought to Sri Lanka for shooting by animal handler Michael Colling. But since the snake and its companion weren't very welcome in the country, he had to book them their own hotel rooms under fake names, Mr. and Mrs. Longfellow. All right, so Dad, what is this movie about?
It's an action adventure which further develops the Indiana Jones character.
I had down Adventure Seeker saves a small Indian village by finding their lost relic while dodging an ancient evil cult. I think that's a pretty good elevator pitch.
Sure.
So then, who was your best performance?
Well, okay. Harrison Ford, hands down, because he's almost a big chunk of the movie. I mean, it's not often that I then talk about one of the worst performances, which only the director's wife would have stood to play Willie,
Well, she was
because
not his wife at the time. He was going through a divorce.
because her character is abysmal, and there's no redeeming quality about her, and they should have just named her Screaming Blonde One, and it would have been perfectly fine, and everybody would have understood.
She's annoying, has almost no chemistry with Harrison Ford, is not believable as the love interest, and frankly, you don't understand through probably 90% of this film why he didn't leave her in the snow.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more on that one, but I know that we went with best performance in the original episode of Raiders with Harrison Ford, and honestly, when it's Indiana Jones, it's hard not to put him. I thought about spreading it around, so then the next obvious candidate was Steven Spielberg, but in my research, he regards this as probably one of his poorest efforts. And because he and both George Lucas at the time were going through divorces, that this film turned out darker than he had really wanted it to. He also recognizes a lot of the mistakes that I'm sure we're going to get to, particularly the dinner scene. So I couldn't really go there. So then I'm like, all right, I can't give it to Kate Capshaw. I don't really think that I can give it to Jonathan Ke Quan, even though he isn't is a significant part of this movie. So who else can I go with? And it's not that I'm by process of elimination giving it to him by default, because I think he just deserves recognition, but I've recognized him so many other times as well. It just feels a little blunted. But to create such an iconic film score as Raiders, and then to follow it up and get nominated yet again, I'm going to go with John Williams. I think this is a distinct film score to itself that really separates it. There really is a marriage with Indiana Jones and the Raiders March, but he introduces so many other elements that really, I guess, give it a tone of different culturism. So Raiders is much more driving and dramatic and upbeat and bright, especially with a lot of horns or brass instruments. Whereas this was much more flute and wood instruments or woodwinds, particularly for some of the sounds that were supposed to be, for lack of a better term, oriental sounding. I know that's not a classically looked upon term at this point, but I think that might be the best way of putting it, unfortunately. I just liked the way that it mimicked certain scenes and gave you a tone for the movie that seemed different and distinct, but really sort of enhanced everything that was going on. So I'm going to go with John Williams.
Okay.
Best secondary performer, and this is the other one that was in contention for my best performer. I'll go with Amrish Puri or Mola Ram. He's probably one of the better villains when it comes to Indiana Jones movies. I think he's by far the most memorable of all the Indiana Jones movies because realistically, the Ark and I guess Belloc is the villain or the antagonist in the first one, but he doesn't seem as menacing or as threatening as Mola Ram, who can literally pull a guy's beating heart out. So I really appreciated that, and I'm going to have more to say on that once we get into the grading, but I thought he was a wonderful performer in this one.
I went with Jonathan Ke Quan. I think the kid was phenomenal for being a small kid. This was basically his first acting role. He's had kind of an interesting career since. I looked him up. He's been a director, an assistant director, a stunt coordinator. Been a cinematographer in films. He's done acting. He's done television. So, but I think that he provided a strong or actor or performer to Harrison Ford in this film.
He certainly is a memorable character. The only problem I might have with that is, and I don't think this is on him per se, I don't know whether or not that's a well written character and not steering into a lot of Asian stereotypes, if that makes sense. I,
Yes.
it kind of straddles a fine line. And again, I don't think that has anything to do with him. I think he did the role as he was expected to and as he probably knew how to do the role, but I'm uncertain, and probably because it would not be offensive to me as a 31-year-old white man, but it does create questions of how our depictions, particularly of Asian Americans or just Asian people in general, is. And so I guess I don't know. I'll plead a level of ignorance on that one. So then we're left with charismatic. Who was your most charismatic?
John Williams.
Interesting. Okay, that's a bit surprising for his charismatic award.
Well, it just because the music of the film is more memorable than the film.
I could have said that for Raiders or even for that matter, Jaws. I think he's
Yes.
created so many iconic scores. I don't think if you played a certain section that isn't the Raiders March that's reused in this one of Temple of Doom that people just automatically will know it in the same ways that they know some of these other ones that he's created. But I guess how are you making that charismatic?
Because there's a certain element, whether you are just thinking it or you're humming it, there are certain times in this film where you are hearing the music even if the music is not playing. I know I catch myself where all of a sudden something happens and I'm da 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 da, and you're
See,
expecting it.
but that's the Raiders March. That's reused. I'm thinking more of the da 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 da, because that's more original to this particular film by
I
comparison.
understand. It's not like I can point to, quite frankly, a ton of performances that I go, oh, these are. I mean, it would have been easy for me to have just named Harrison Ford again, but
Well, that's where I went. I think it's just obvious, but I gave it to him almost out of default. I mean, who else is that appealing in this movie?
yeah.
You're not going to nominate the kid. I don't know if I would say Mola Ram was particularly charismatic, given that he's pulling guys' hearts out of their chests. The Maharaja, no, he's playing with voodoo dolls. Oddly enough, So yeah, at that point, I'm at a loss to give it to anybody other than Harrison Ford, who looks stunningly great in this movie for just like a physical specimen. That guy could have cleaned up in the '80s. All right, so that takes us to best scene. The nominees that I'll put down: the airplane crash, the dinner scene. I'll name it the trapdoors and bug rooms, Kali Ma, the Black Death of Kali Ma, and then the bridge fight. Are there any that you think I missed?
The initial scene of arriving in the village.
Okay. Yeah, I could buy that.
But otherwise, no, there isn't anything else.
I guess what would you argue then is the best scene?
The final escape out of the temple. It's energetic. It's exciting. There's a level of suspense. It's by far to me the most put together and the most well designed scene in the film.
But I think that part has like three different, or that, excuse me, that scene or that sequence has three different parts to it. There is the thug fight where he's fighting the big guy. There is the bridge fight at the end. And then there's the minecart chase. Out of those, if you were to dissect into one part or the other, which one are you describing?
Being on the mining carts and that whole sequence is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I would agree that it is quite thrilling. It's interesting that I started to notice as I was watching it how long that sequence actually is. Because you're talking about, I think that it's at least a good 5 minute scene where he's in the fight with the guy and then he ends up getting crushed to death. Then you have the minecar scene, which I swear it has to be like 10 minutes by itself. And then the bridge fight is like the last 10 minutes of the movie. So I think that's about the last half an hour of the movie is essentially just them escaping.
Yes.
From a technical standpoint, you're talking about the music and the score. You're talking about, as we mentioned before in the Did You Know section, the sound effects. You're talking about the editing for the minecart. So, from a technical standpoint, I would agree. I think from a writing standpoint, there aren't any particular scenes that stick out to me. You're burying the exposition in that dinner scene, which I think is one of the more controversial ones. And again, we're going to get to that when we get into the actual grading. What that leaves me with is what I would say is probably my favorite and the most indelible, and that's the Kalima scene. The first glances that we get of the Thugee and the Thugee ceremony, where, and I've mentioned it now a handful of times already, but Mola Ram pulling the guy's heart out is terrifying. Like, if you're seeing that as a 10-year-old kid in the theater for the first time, I mean, that's got to be making you shit your pants. You didn't even know that that was possible in a film. And the way that they're able to pull off that level of a stunt and then have the heart literally explode on fire in his hand, I mean, that's just outstanding. And it's the thing that I think pop culturally that most people call back to about this particular film. There are a couple of other references from some of the other ones. I think the most often referenced one is Raiders, with obvious reasons. Crusade gets a few references here or there, but occasionally, and if you're going to get something pop culturally that is bigger than the movie, it's usually the Kalima.
I agree that that was a very terrifying point, and I remember that scene, that group of scenes, and then the banquet itself were a point. I used to watch while I was in college because it came on right before I would go to dinner, and then I watched it in the summer as well when I was home for the summer before dinner. Was Entertainment Tonight, and those scenes were they did like a week long piece talking about the need for this PG-13, citing those as being well beyond what normal children should be watching without having parents involved or knowing what's going on.
Yeah, there's an incredibly large amount of violence in this movie. I mean, you have a good amount in Raiders, but this one took it to a new level that I agree. There should have been a difference in what you could subject a 5 year old to versus a 13-year old. I don't know if they can handle what happens in that scene. So I already nominated that though as my most indelible and favorite. But what would you say then is your favorite and most indelible?
Well, it's the escape on the cart or on the mining carts, and the most indelible is that banquet. That banquet just still, that was the one part of the film that, having not seen this in probably 30 years or more, 35 years, that I still remembered. And I'm going, ugh, the chilled monkey brains and the eyeball soup and all of that just was. It did not leave my stomach feeling well.
I certainly can't say that it did for me either. And I also understand fully that if that were described how my culture is or how people saw my culture for 20 years, that I'd be a little upset too.
Yeah, well, I think on the our family text that we have going line, somebody had posted on Reddit a list, or it was on Twitter, a list of things that whether you've tried them or not, and they had a whole list of different strange or exotic foods that people would not try. And quite frankly, the list was, I think I had consumed 24 of the 30. It was things like squid and octopus and some other things like that. Beef tartare, turtle. So I've been adventuresome, and I've had to be at times, having traveled as much as I have, especially in Asia, where the tastes are a little different. But this still grossed me out. I just I'll
And
be
that's the intention of the scene.
yeah.
Well, before we get more into that one, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us. All right, Dad, before we get into best funniest lines, do we have anyone to remember this week?
Yes, Una Stubbs, British actress, best known more for TV work, but she did some movies. Death Do Us Part was a TV show, and then more well known as the landlady in Sherlock. She had been friends with Benedict Cumberbatch's mother and had known Cumberbatch since he was 4 years old, and got to play Mrs. Hudson on the TV show. She passed away this week.
Yeah, and it's really too bad. I know the show has had longer and longer gaps as both Martin Freeman and Benedict Cumberbatch are doing other things, particularly in the Marvel universe, but also Martin Freeman had that 3 movie deal doing the Hobbit movies. So we haven't gotten as much Sherlock, but I think she's probably the most notable Mrs. Hudson of all the iterations we've had of Sherlock to this point. Most of them are just background characters that might say a line or two, and she's just kind of a periphery character, whereas in Sherlock, she's somewhat of an active character. And so for her to pass away, now while we're in kind of this no man's land, I know that both of the actors have said they would like to return to it at some point. I just don't know when that's going to be because of all of their other obligations because they just became big stars. But, how they're going to handle that. And unfortunately, that's the reality of what we've been dealing with over the last, I don't know, 10 years that actors who are well known for particular TV shows or characters that we just love spending time with have passed away, and we're going to need to deal with what those characters and those universes are going to be like without them, especially as TV and movies kind of blend together and we have these more continued universes. So I would definitely recommend the TV show Sherlock to begin with, but this week, I would especially do so because we'd love to remember her performance in that show. I think all 4 seasons. I'm pretty sure it's
Yes,
4. are available, I think, on Netflix yet. So certainly, at least in the United States, you can search the Real Good app in order to find wherever else it's streaming. But I would take some time and spend either catching up on that show or maybe rewatching it because I know both of us have really enjoyed it. And we take a moment of silence now in her memory. Thank you. All right, best funniest lines. First one I had down. And this was actually a very difficult movie for me to find lines that I really thought were worthy of pulling out. This wasn't as good of a dialogued movie as the first one. I think Lawrence Kasdan is a much better dialogue writer than I think it's what was it? Willard Huck. Willard Huck. Regardless, what is Shankara? Fortune and glory, kid. Fortune and glory.
Short round. I keep telling you, you listen to me more. You live longer. I've been saying that for decades.
As have I. I've told you all repeatedly that, well, maybe not quite in that way, but the world would be a better place if people just listened to me.
I've been saying that since you were born.
I don't remember you saying that. I do remember saying that you were the, what, second or third smartest man alive,
Second. Second smartest man in the world.
behind only God.
Well, no, Jesus, because Jesus is God's not man. But, they're there, and then I'm right below. And as children, that's all you needed to know.
Next one I had down, Kalima. Kalima.
Willie Scott, hey, I can't go to Pankot. I'm a singer. I need to call my agent.
Dr. Jones, wasn't it the Sultan of Madagascar who threatened to cut off your head if you ever returned to his country? No, it wasn't my head. Then your hands, perhaps. No, it wasn't my hands, it was my. Looks down between his legs. My misunderstanding.
Indiana Jones, that wasn't so bad, was it?
You're saying it's sultry like, but that was after they floated down in the raft. Indiana Jones. Wear your jewels to bed, princess? Yeah, and nothing else. Shock you? Nothing shocks me. I'm a scientist. Now, that by itself seems just dumb, but I actually thought that the writing of the subsequent dialogue after that was actually pretty good. I just couldn't find the location to actually print that off because there was some almost James Bond level quippiness going on in that next part. So go back and watch that if you haven't watched the movie yet. Any other lines to nominate?
I have none.
I don't either. So out of those, best funniest line?
Ugh. Fortune and glory, kid. Fortune and glory.
I'd probably go with Kali Ma personally, but funniest line to me was the one I pulled out before. It wasn't my hands.
Yeah.
I thought that was actually a pretty decent exposition there. All right,
It was good.
Stanley rubric time. Legacy first up. Do you want to go first or you want me?
Go ahead.
All right. If for nothing else, creating the PG 13 rating would be a huge legacy for most movies, but this made Indiana Jones from a solo movie into a franchise that was clearly bankable. Mixed reviews be damned, this does have a exponential factor because we got Last Crusade, we got Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, we've got another movie coming eventually. So the continued batting average of George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Harrison Ford, while we forget a fourth movie from 2007 that's already been brought up too much on this podcast for my taste, I still think that the legacy as a character, as a franchise, is expanded by what I would say ultimately is a successful second movie, even if it's not treated as one of the top of this franchise. So I think because there is that fourth movie, that some of the sins of this movie kind of get minimized, and it gets a little bit of the Hoover outlive the bastards treatment in the culture at large. So I'm going to go 3.5 for the industry. I'll go 2.5 for the audience for a 6 overall.
I went with a I went with the industry. I went with a 5 simply because I was having a hard time thinking of another movie franchise, so to speak, without it being a complete sequel. And we're not going to discuss Jaws 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, Sharknado.
Star Wars had Empire before this.
Yes, I understand that, but it was a true sequel. It was a film that built on the last one. Other than the character and the general placement, this was actually a prequel a year before the previous film, so that it stood independently and on its own, but the character transcend. Also, just the fact of the PG-13, I think, was huge. I think it really highlighted a significant limitation in the whole concept of movie ratings. Since the movie rating system had been implemented in 1968, this was the first change that was made, and the only one of two changes total. 1990, they did away with the rating of X and replaced it with NC-17 because X had been deemed too attuned with pornographic material, so they did away with it. But so for that reason, I went with a 5. Now, as far as legacy for the public, I think this film far is not in the scope or mind of the public. It wasn't in my mind. Raiders, and then Last Crusade, and I'll maybe tip, but the fact that Harrison Ford actually had somebody as capable as himself of filling the screen to share it with was a huge factor. And so I think this film falls as a result of the success of the first and the third. So I went with a 2.5 for a 7.5 total.
Okay. So that's a 6.75 between us on an average. Impact significance. Let's see or what you got.
Well, as far as industry itself goes, I don't think it had a huge impact on movies and movie making in general. So for the industry, I went with a 2.5. And while it drew well, and I remember going and seeing it, having lived through that summer, it was not nearly as popular as Ghostbusters and Beverly Hills Cop. They were by far what everyone was discussing and talking about. And as a result, I went there with a 3. And I only went to 3 because it did draw audiences and did have a large box office. So therefore, I went with a 5.5.
Okay. So I was going to give this a 2 in the industry side due to mixed reviews, little awards attention, and it was notably deadpanned at the time, primarily because of its dark nature that Temple of Doom needed to create the PG-13 label, but it's still impactful. I mean, PG-13 and whether something is PG-13, even deserving of an R rating, is discussed in how movie cultures is still going about. So just on a short term impact, the fact that this needed one less than 2 months after it was released, and given that the first one had been in theaters for so long, this thing had a tail. And yes, I may agree with you that, okay, Ghostbusters, Beverly Hills Cop might have been bigger movies, I guess, among the talking culture. The fact that this was still a high grossing performer does give it some oomph, if you will. So even though the PG 13 thing is maybe a negative impact, I still think it causes an impact that has some significance well after the fact. So I ended up at a 2.5 for the industry because overall it's creating another franchise in the 80s where we were just getting to the point of creating franchises. Just from that standpoint, you're continuing on the character. I don't think you can completely dismiss it. But because it was such a big box office thing, and I do take your comment to heart a bit, I just, you can't really argue with some of the numbers that were there from an audience share. I ended up going with a 4 on that for a 6.5 total. So that'll end up being a 6 between us. All right, novelty. And this is one where I think that in recent shows, listening back to them, that I think you've been a little too critical if something is not completely original. And so I have a feeling that you're going to give this one demerits primarily on the standpoint that it is a sequel. The one thing I will draw upon is while it's not completely reinventing the wheel with Indiana Jones as the character, it is novel from the standpoint of everything around him. They take a lot of chances in this movie by making it somewhat of a prequel, by not involving the Nazis, which was why it was a prequel. Apparently, George Lucas didn't want them to be the primary villain. He wanted to kind of mix it up. Actually, this is one of the more diversified casts for a franchise movie of the time. You had a lot of Indian actors and legitimate Indian actors. You had several Asian American actors in the roles. So you really actually had some of the things that we commonly criticize about some of the other movies and kind of made them endearing characters on their own to a franchise that at the time was one of the biggest around. I mean, Raiders was a huge movie. So to really come out swinging on this one and take the chances of, I mean, the primary villain in this one has nothing to do with Western culture at all. You're expecting audiences to buy into a ancient cult called the Thugee, which I think is a little too on the nose if you ask me, that has to do with Hindi religion and the Shankara stones, which you're either going to need a lot of explanation for in the course of the movie, or people are just going to look past it and say, okay, we're hunting for some magical rocks. And that's all it has to be. So I think from that standpoint, it is kind of daring that you're taking what would be a huge property and making some very bold choices. I went with a 7.
Well, I'm gonna make the math a little difficult for you. I went with a 7 simply because this film is a standalone film and it is a prequel and it tries to fill in some of the gaps of who Indiana Jones was and what made him the character he was in the first film. As a result, I thought that was kind of a bold choice. As a result, I think it went far beyond what I would have expected. And so that's why I generally go with that. And so that's why I went with a 7.
Interesting.
So, do you need help with the math?
No, I think I got this one. 7, I think is the average.
Okay.
Classicness. I always let you go first, so have a way.
I always start at 5 and go up or down from that. And your comments a few minutes ago were prescient. There was a lot of diversity in this cast. A lot more diversity of and cast of any film I remember seeing in the 1980s. And as a result, I thought it was well done. I mean, it wasn't like they were trying to pigeonhole, it's not Mickey Rooney from Breakfast at Tiffany.
No, very far from that.
Yeah. And
It's
so,
not even Long Dong Duck from 16 Candles.
yeah.
Same year, by the way.
Oh, yeah, I guess it was, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So, I actually gave it fairly high marks for classicness. The portrayal, I think, was overdone of Indian or of Southeast Asian culture, as they're all about eating these weird things that Westerners would never touch, and that went way beyond what it should be. I mean, I've spent time in China, and yes, they do have duck feet soup, and with duck feet in the soup, but it's not like you eat the duck feet, you just eat the soup, which, when you think about it, how much worse is it than any, like, throwing bones into soup in order to get the flavor. So I gave it some points down because of the over the top aspect of the food in the banquet scene. So I went with an 8.
Interesting. You and I are going to be off on this one. I actually went in a couple of different directions that you didn't mention. Yes, the diversity of this cast does probably give it a boost up. And I normally start at a 7, not a 5 like you do. So I want to say that that is daring by itself and probably should be rewarded with an additional point in my scale. But there are some definite problems, and it's not just the banquet scene. Although I think that is a major issue with this movie. Because as bad as what I guess we've had in The Reckoning, that was the Apu character from just The Simpsons, can you imagine what this movie did to every kid that went to school with either an Asian American kid or an Indian kid for like 20 years until we knew better or at least started to feel better? Oh, you eat eyeball soup and all the stupid things and mean things that kids would say to each other. I mean, I gotta imagine life was pretty tough because of this movie, and I know that it wasn't necessarily the intention, but it was kind of sloppy, if you ask me.
Yeah.
So there's just one big part of it, but the Willie character, that is just one of the worst written female heroines. As much as we criticized for Karen Allen just being a damsel the whole time, like this is almost farcical. I
Yeah.
don't understand why she's in this movie. Like, not just Kate Capshaw, just the character. The movie would work just fine without Indiana Jones having a love interest. Like, his relationship with the kid would be just rewarding enough. I actually thought that was some of the best emotional parts of the movie is Short Round and, you know, you're my best friend, Indy. I love you. You know, that by itself would have worked on the heartstrings of America, but we had to somehow throw a blonde woman into the middle of this movie to do what? She's just there to basically be a pawn in everything else that's going on. Did we really need her as a bystander to be lowered down into the lava pit? Like that's yeah. I just don't understand her at all. And then finally, if you're gonna pick on this movie for something, this might be one of the worst cases of white savior. The American Dr. Jones shows up in the Indian village and he's sent by Shiva to rescue them, and he's the only person that can. Like, they have no agency whatsoever. They don't even help him. Like, I think they have a couple of guides up to about the door of Pankot Palace, and then they just, like, leave him on his own, and he's supposed to rescue their village and all of their children? Like, there's hundreds of children. How many? But there's what, 20, 30 villagers? Are all of those villagers having like 30 kids? I mean, I know India is a rather large population country, but I mean, come on. This just doesn't make sense to me. If you're gonna have him be the leader for the cause, you should at least like have one or two people go with him. That's where you could have written in a female character that makes more sense, like his guide or something else. That would have been a better movie and a better character. That she may have been stronger because she was the one drafted to help save the village. Anyway, that's 21st century thinking for a mid 80s movie. But regardless, I ended up at a 5 for this, to be honest.
So I'm at 5, you're at 7. So do you need help with that one?
You mean you're at 8 and I'm at 5?
Oh, sure.
Well, that's a 6.5 between us.
Wow.
Rewatchability. Since I'm a little bit more favorable on this franchise just generally than you are, I'll take this one first. It's probably third on my list of watchables. I honestly haven't watched this one nearly as much. I think Raiders by itself, I've probably watched twice as much as the rest of the movies combined. So there's a reason why that one finished. I think it was either a 9.5 or a 10 for me last week. This one, I enjoy it. I actually found myself enjoying it a little bit more this rewatch through, but it's not one I'm going to visit very often, and certainly not as much as Raiders. It's not quite a 7 that I relate with some of the better quality films that I think I should probably watch more. So I ended up going with a 6.5.
My standard is I give a 2 to rewatchability if it's a film that I will, if absolutely forced to, rewatch. A 5 is a film that I like to rewatch, but on a very limited basis. This film I hadn't seen since I saw it in the movie theater, and having watched it, large portions of it I had forgotten about. And by the time I was done, I realized why I hadn't seen it again. It was like dark, it was ominous, it was not nearly as much fun as the as film 1 and 3. And as a result, this would not be one that I would like to rewatch very often. If somebody says, "Hey, let's rewatch it," okay, I guess I can rewatch it. So to that extent, I went with a 4. It's a decent film. I'm not criticizing it for that. It's just that there's just nothing in this that I would go, "Oh yeah, I need to rewatch this," or I need to donate the 2 hours to it again sometime in the near future.
All right, just to recap then, we have a 6.75 for legacy, a 6 for impact significance, a 7 for novelty, a 6.5 for classicness. The last category with your score makes it a 5.25 average between us. And then finally, for audience score, we had an 89% for Google users and 81% for Rotten Tomato users. That gave us an 8.5 overall for 85%. And all told, that adds up to 40 total points on the rubric. And that slots it in at number 66 currently, in between Inglorious Bastards and Mr. Roberts.
All right.
So on the bottom quarter of the list so far.
Sure.
All right, remaining questions for you.
What happened to Willie Scott? All that screaming. How in the world is she going to go back to a singing career?
Okay. I mean, maybe that was her singing.
Pre Black Sabbath.
No, I actually think this might have been after. Oh, well, I mean, I guess in the
The
course of the movie
movie would
said,
have
yeah, it
been.
was taking place in 35. How did the Thugee come back in the first place? Like, they clearly built up power, but it's like they had some weird underground plot that was completely unbeknownst to everybody. I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe they stole an election.
You got any others?
No.
If Indiana only cut one side of the bridge, why did it tear in half? Wouldn't the bridge just like pivot downward and everybody be hanging from the one rope?
Yes.
I don't know. That one has never made sense to me. And then finally, and this was remarkable to me because I'm like, this has got to be a plot hole. Why did the pilots need to fly into the Himalayas like several hundred miles just to crash the plane? Wouldn't you like get it up to a certain height and then just let it go?
Well, you wouldn't want to crash it over the water because you parachute, you've got nothing. Okay. So, I mean, if you parachute out and you're not that high, or you're too high, I guess, then you're going to suffocate when you jump out of the plane.
I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me that if their whole aim was in the end to jump out of the plane and crash it so that Indiana Jones couldn't escape, why you have to go that far just to do it. And basically it's just a plot delivery point that it essentially causes them to end up in India, but come on. All right, so that was my remaining questions. If you don't have any, last thoughts for the week.
Uh, None, not really. I'm looking forward to next week's episode because I enjoy that film, and as I've indicated, it's because of the secondary performance.
Yeah, I actually think that the villain is a little bit better formed than even in Raiders, although it does give you some questions that I'm sure we're going to bring up, like, why the Nazi doctor would be both attracted to Indiana Jones and his father, but then again, it's Harrison Ford and Sean Connery arguably two of the sexiest men ever alive.
Yes, Joseph Kennedy and John Kennedy each shared a mistress, so hey.
Well, thanks for that uncomfortable thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any other great thoughts this week other than this is going to be episode 79. We're going to finish up with episode 80, and then we only have one other episode before we get to our month of Bond. Looking forward to No Time to Die while we're actually on vacation. So we're going to be off with some of the stuff that needs to be updated. So we're going to have a long list, I'm sure, of people when we get back for the in memoriam, but
Hopefully not.
yeah, I shouldn't wish that, I suppose. But we have some very exciting movies coming up to end the year.
Yes.
I had not announced this publicly, but we've had this plan of what to do for December for a while. And we have 3 Christmas movies back to back, the last 2 of which are going to cause quite an argument on the show. I'm not ready to say what they are quite yet, but we at least have one guest lined up for or one of the episodes. We'll see
One
what
of
else
them
happens.
is not a Christmas movie.
Then the other one is not either.
Yes, it is, because it's the spirit of Christmas.
There is no such thing.
Yes, there is.
Okay, you're mistaking Christmas movies with movies that take place at Christmas. So either they're all Christmas movies or they're not.
There has to be a Christmas theme. It's not a Christmas movie if the movie takes place at Christmas and it's basically shoot 'em up and kill them.
Okay, I'm sorry. We've already dropped enough hints. So the 2 Christmas movies back to back, because I thought this would be a great way to develop the show. Die Hard and It's a Wonderful Life. So you have that to look forward to.
Yes, this is what I have to live with.
Every day, folks. Every day.
Yeah.
Well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us and the microphones. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Next week, we are finishing the original Indiana Jones trilogy with The Last Crusade, starring Harrison Ford, Sean Connery, Julian Glover, and Denholm Elliott. You won't want to miss that one, so please watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that you can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com, find us on Instagram at GMotePodcast, or find us on Twitter at GMotePodcast. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.